The wind was a famished wolf scouring the high plains that day, its teeth tearing relentlessly at the small, tenacious cabin Rachel and Thomas wrestled from the unforgiving land. Its ceaseless howls through the parched, whispering grass sounded less like secrets, more like the raw, aching hunger of emptiness itself. Near the bruised lip of the horizon, dust devils writhed like tormented souls beneath a sun that burned with a white-hot, pitiless fury. Earlier, unsettling details had pricked Rachel's consciousness like thorns. The heavy latch on their sturdy gate, always meticulously secured by Thomas, inexplicably loose, banging softly, insistently in the wind's rough breath. Down by the dwindling creek, faint, unfamiliar hoof prints. Smaller than their sturdy farm horses, deliberately half-erased, it seemed marked the thirsty earth. A broken twig lay nearby, snapped clean as if someone had paused there listening. And high above, a lone hawk had circled its cry-piercing, unnaturally sharp cut, brutally short, leaving behind a vast, vibrating silence, where even the prairie dogs had vanished into their holes. Small things perhaps easily dismissed as tricks of the wind, or nerves stretched taut by isolation, but which now coalesced into a shapeless, cloying dread tightening around her heart. A half-forgotten unease surfaced, a fleeting image from Thomas's quiet recounting of a past journey near the treacherous Red River borderlands. Talk of desperate men's sudden violence and the glint of worn blue uniforms far from any rightful post. A memory usually buried deep, now stirring unbidden like disturbed sediment. Inside the familiar, comforting aroma of baking bread, a scent of home of defiant permanence. Warred with the sudden prickling tension tightening Rachel's shoulders like a vice heavy. With 8 months of pregnancy, she moved with the deliberate, ponderous weight of one carrying life's most precious, vulnerable cargo, her hand resting protectively, almost constantly, on the taut swell of her belly. Their child stirred restlessly within, a tangible, fierce promise flickering against the desolate, indifferent landscape. Feeling the world shift today, little spark, she murmured, kneading the dough with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Was it only the heat making the air shimmer strangely beyond the window, or had a shadow flickered for an instant at the edge of her vision, near the woodpile? She shook her head, dismissing it. Nerves. Through the warped, sun-bleached window pane, Thomas's silhouette mending the perpetually storm-battered fence was her steadfast anchor in the vast, consuming emptiness. Yet viewed through the anxious filter of her unease, he seemed smaller today, diminished somehow against the endless, devouring expanse. Terribly vulnerable. A chill skittered down her spine, unrelated to the oppressive heat. She felt a sudden urge to call him in to check the rifle resting above the mantel to bar the door. Nonsense, surely. The loneliness of the plains preyed on the mind. He senses change coming. Thomas called out, his voice startlingly close as he suddenly appeared at the cabin door frame, filling the entrance, reaching for the communal dipper. He wiped sweat and grime from his brow with a weary forearm, his steady gray eyes meeting hers, holding that familiar fusion of shared warmth, weary resilience, and the burgeoning anticipation that colored their days. Prairie dogs hiding deep says the air feels tight today. Might be a squall blowing in, or just nerves. He glanced towards the horizon, then back at her concern, softening his features. Or maybe he's impatient like his father. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of damp hair from her temple, his calloused touch infinitely gentle. His fingers lingered for a conscious moment near the small, worn leather pouch she always wore suspended on a thong around her neck. A cherished gift from him. It contained a dried prairie rose and a single hawk feather, darker, sleeker than the local red tails found years ago near the treacherous Red River borderlands. During that prospecting trip, shrouded in unsettling memories, he rarely spoke of the hawk feather. She almost voiced the disquietude rising in her, the specific memory of his story. the snapped hawk cry, the uneasy feeling something was watching, but bit it back, not wanting to burden his already weary spirit. Soon. Rachel, our future arrives soon. Soon. She echoed, leaning into his brief, solid touch, the simple intimacy, a fragile bulwark against the nameless anxiety gnawing at her peace. They possessed so little. This hand-hewn cabin, the stubborn garden wrestling life from dry soil, the magnificent, terrifying land. But their shared existence felt like a fortress against the immensity, the familiar groan of floorboards and the wind's low sigh now carrying an unfamiliar discordant note, the distant, intermittent lowing of their lone steer, precarious notes in the symphony of their hard-won life. Thomas returned to his work, the rhythmic clang. Clang, clang of his hammer, a reassuring heartbeat against the immense waiting quiet. Rachel hummed a half-forgotten hymn, trying to weave normalcy through the fraying threads of the afternoon. But the disquiet persisted, sharpening like a honed blade against her senses. And then it found its voice. The wind shifted direction abruptly, carrying not the familiar sounds of the prairie, rustling grass bird calls, but something terrifyingly distinct, the unmistakable pounding rhythm of multiple horses approaching at a brutal, relentless gallop. Not the measured gait of travelers, but a pace speaking of frantic flight or vicious, cruel pursuit. The hammering outside ceased instantly. A cold, absolute silence descended, pressing in on her eardrums, heavy and expectant, heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. Rachel moved heavily, awkwardly toward the window, hand instinctively cradling her belly. Figures shimmered out of the merciless heat haze, coalescing into riders. Grim, hard-bitten men propelled by a ragged, desperate urgency that radiated malice like heat waves off a struck anvil. 5 of them, their clothing tattered remnants of Union Army blue, clinging stubbornly, screaming their origin even at this distance. Deserters' renegades' ice formed in her veins, sharp and paralyzing. They weren't passing by on some distant track, they were making straight for the cabin. Straight for Thomas. Straight for her. She saw Thomas straighten from his work hand, shielding his eyes against the glare. His initial stance open, perhaps wary, but expecting travelers needing water, shifted instantly to tense, rigid appraisal. She watched helpless as he let the heavy hammer drop softly, deliberately, into the dust, keeping his hands open. Visible, held slightly away from his body, away from the wood-splitting axe leaning innocently nearby. A clear, universal signal of non-aggression in this harsh land, a scream. Run Thomas the axe. Grabbed the axe, clawed at her throat, burning like bile. But terror locked it down, rooting her feet to the rough-hewn floorboards. She was a powerless spectator watching her world poised on the brittle edge of shattering. The riders' faces, grimed with dust and malice, circled him like wolves, assessing cornered prey. Their lathered horses stamping nervously, sensing the tension. Their voices, coarse and punctuated by ugly, jeering laughter, carried faintly on the newly charged wind. She couldn't decipher exact words, only the menacing cadence, the predatory tightening of the circle. One rider, younger, looked nervously back over his shoulder toward the distant hills as if expecting pursuit, before turning his attention back to Thomas, his fear seemingly fueling his cruelty. Rachel pressed her hand flat against the warm windowpane knuckles, bone-white, her breath catching in her throat. In that desperate moment, her eyes darted frantically around the small cabin. The heavy iron poker by the hearth, too low, awkward to wield, especially in her condition. The sharp carving knife glinting on the sideboard too far. One of the riders, having dismounted fluidly on the far side, unseen by Thomas, was already positioning himself with chilling purpose near that wall, casually leaning against it, blocking any quick approach she might contemplate from that direction. Trapped. The calculation in his stance sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her. Thomas stood his ground, shoulders squared, refusing to show fear, His voice carried firm, laced with careful reason where reason had clearly fled. "Ho there, bit thirsty on a day like this. If it's water you need, or supplies, take what you need, but move on peaceably." Supplies. The tallest rider, raw-boned, with eyes like obsidian chips, embedded in a sun-scorched face, swung down heavily from his horse. The leader. His gaze flickered contemptuously over the small cabin. The struggling garden. "Water sounds mighty fine. Maybe something stronger, eh, boys?" He sneered, drawing coarse chuckles from his companions. He swaggered towards Thomas, hand resting insolently on the butt of a holstered pistol strapped low on his hip. "We'll decide what we need, farmer." He jerked his chin curtly. Two others dismounted with brutal practiced speed, flanking Thomas instantly. Movement sharp and predatory, cutting off any path of retreat towards the relative safety of the cabin or the potential salvation of the nearby axe. One muttered just loud enough for Rachel to perhaps imagine she heard it, lips curling in a vile grin. "Should be easy pickings, boss, just the farmer, and looks like dessert waiting inside." The word struck her like a physical blow. Thomas took a single, almost imperceptible half-step back, hands raised slightly higher, palms out. "Easy now, just take it easy. The woman inside, she's heavy with child, close to her time. Take the water, food from the stores, even the horse if you need him. No need for trouble. We have little, but share what we can." He pleaded, not for himself, she realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that ripped through her fear, but for her, for their unborn child, for their fragile future. His plea was met with a cold, sneering silence that stretched agonizingly. Then abruptly, without warning, rough hands seized his arms, twisting them savagely behind his back. Thomas roared, not in pain, but in sheer protective fury. Adrenaline lending shocking strength to his lean frame. He twisted violently, slamming an elbow backward with surprising force into one man's ribs, earning a sharp, winded grunt. For one heart-stopping, hope-filled second, Rachel saw him almost break free, eyes darting desperately towards the leaning axe, a glint of impossible salvation. But the third man reacted instantly, swinging the heavy walnut butt of his rifle in a vicious, efficient arc, slamming it brutally into Thomas's lower back, just above the kidneys. Thomas gasped, buckling forward violently, air punched raggedly from his lungs. Phew. They wrestled him. Then cruelly efficient, half dragging him towards the cabin door, his worn boot heels scarring deep, desperate lines in the unforgiving earth. His face was a mask of agonized determination, strained against the blinding pain. But his eyes found hers through the grimy window pane, locked onto her, filled with a desperate message of fierce love. Primal fear and a devastating silent apology. "Forgive me. Forgive me for bringing this upon you." The cabin door exploded inward, ripped from its sturdy leather hinges with savage force, slamming violently against the interior wall, shaking the very foundations, dislodging dust from the rafters. They hurled Thomas inside like discarded grain, shoving him stumbling towards the rough-hewn table where the forgotten bread dough sat peacefully rising, a symbol of violated domesticity. Rachel recoiled instinctively, hand flying protectively to her belly, the other clamped over her mouth to stifle a terrified cry. The comforting scent of home was instantly smothered, overwhelmed by the invasive stench of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and raw, terrifying menace. The leader's gaze swept the room. Meager stores stacked neatly, simple handcrafted furnishings. His eyes cold, flat, calculating ownership, before landing with predatory deliberation on Rachel. A slow, reptilian grin spread across his stubbled face, revealing stained, broken teeth. "Well now," he drawled, his voice scraping like rock salt on dry wood. "Looky here, boys," stumbled onto a cozy little nest, all warm and ripe. His eyes lingered insultingly on her swollen form. "Leave her alone." Thomas snarled, lunging again with astonishing ferocity, despite the crippling pain radiating from his back. He strained, bucking like a captured mustang, almost breaking one captor's hold again. Take the horses, the food, my rifle. Just leave her out of this. For God's sake, she's—" A harsh, barking laugh cut him short. The two men holding him slammed him forward again, face first, hard against the table's sturdy edge. The sickening crack of wood splintering, or was it bone yielding, echoed horribly loud in the suddenly confined space. Another deserter. The one who had blocked the knife efficiently produced a length of rough rope, binding Thomas's wrists tightly behind him. The coarse fibers biting cruelly into scraped, bleeding skin. Thomas strained violently against the bonds muscles cording in his arms and neck, his blazing gaze locked unwaveringly, desperately on Rachel's face. "Forgive me. Stay strong. Survive. Find a way. I love you." The message burned in his eyes. "Oh, we aim to take exactly what we want, farmer." The leader sneered, his chilling attention snapping back fully to Rachel. He took a deliberate, insolent step closer, violating her space, his sour breath hot and fetid on her face. His bloodshot eyes crawled slowly, deliberately over her form, lingering with degrading intensity on her swollen belly. "Right neighborly of you, baking fresh bread for us. Been busy making yourself a family out here. Shame to interrupt the proceedings." He raised a grimy hand, scarred knuckles flexing, reaching slowly, deliberately, as if to stroke her cheek, to claim her, to assert ownership. Rachel recoiled violently, stumbling backward until the cold, unyielding stone of the fireplace pressed hard against her spine. Tomb-like, her eyes darted again, the poker still impossibly low out of reach, the knife definitely blocked now by the leering guard who smirked openly, enjoying her palpable terror. A useless, strangled whimper escaped her lips, trapped utterly, hopelessly trapped. She edged slightly, hopelessly along the hearth, eyes flicking again to the heavy iron poker handle, just visible behind a pile of kindling. Could she? Even if she reached it. "Don't you touch her, you bastard." Thomas roared again, voice raw with fury and the corrosive agony of utter helplessness. He kicked backward with savage, desperate force, catching one captor square in the kneecap. The man howled in pain, buckling slightly, his grip momentarily slackening. Thomas surged upward again, ignoring the fire consuming his back, smashing his forehead backward with all his might into the other man's face. A wet, sickening crunch. Blood spurted instantly from a broken nose. Hope, sharp, blinding, unexpected, surged anew in Rachel's chest. Could he possibly? But the leader, with chilling, unhurried calm, turned from Rachel and struck Thomas hard across the face, backhanded. A brutal, contemptuous blow that split Thomas's lip wide open. Blood welled instantly, bright crimson droplets splattering onto the pale surface of the table, staining the waiting dough. Thomas spat defiantly, a mixture of blood and saliva. His eyes blazing pure, undiluted hatred at the leader, and the leader chuckled a low grating sound, completely devoid of warmth or humor. "Feisty pair," he remarked conversationally to his remaining conscious men. Though his eyes, narrowed now into glacial slits, remained fixed on Thomas with cold assessment. Loyalty commendable. I suppose in its own stupid way, stupid as hell out here in the middle of nowhere. He nodded curtly to the burly man Thomas had kneed, whose face was now a twisted mask of vengeful fury as he clutched his injured leg. "This one's got too much fight left in him. Mouthy too, interfering with business." He paused, then added with chilling finality, "Put him out and keep it quiet, Mick. Don't want to spook the little mother hen here too much before we—" His implication hung heavy and poisonous in the air. Time fractured into agonizing slow-motion slivers before snapping back with horrific, unavoidable finality. Rachel saw the dull glint of steel as the burly man named Mick drew a long, thin-bladed knife honed sharp for gutting game, or meant its edge catching the light streaming through the violated doorway. She saw the flicker of cruel anticipation, of relish in his vacant eyes. She saw Thomas brace himself, sucking in a sharp, final, shuddering breath, his gaze tearing away from his killer for one fraction of a second, to lock onto hers one last, eternal, soul-shattering time. Love, agony, terror. Farewell. Survive. Thomas, no, please don't. The scream ripped from Rachel's throat, raw, primal, tearing through the suffocating tension like lightning across a bruised sky. But it was lost, utterly swallowed instantly by the wet, sickening thump as the blade plunged deep into Thomas's chest, just below the ribs, angling cruelly, expertly upward towards his heart. His body arched backward in a violent, spastic convulsion against the ropes, a choked, rattling gasp tearing horribly from his lips. The fierce, indomitable light in his eyes, the very essence of her. Thomas, her rock, her world, flickered violently, sputtered like a dying candle flame in a vicious gale, and was abruptly, irrevocably extinguished. He slumped forward, limp as a rag doll held suspended grotesquely against the edge of the table, only by the cruel ropes binding his lifeless arms behind him, the killer. Mick wrenched the knife free with a low grunt of exertion and obscene satisfaction, wiping the blade with grotesque casualness on the shoulder of Thomas's rapidly darkening blood-soaked shirt. Absolute crushing silence descended heavy as a burial shroud punctuated only by Rachel's strangled, tearing sobs being ripped unwillingly from the very depths of her soul, and the slow, obscene drip, drip, drip of Thomas's lifeblood onto the thirsty, rough-hewn floorboards. The world spun, tilted violently on its axis, dropping away beneath her feet into a black, reeling abyss of nothingness. Thomas gone, slaughtered before her eyes. Horror, stark and absolute, slammed into her chest, stealing her breath, her marrow, her strength. She slid weakly down the cold, unforgiving stone of the fireplace, collapsing onto the rough floor in a broken, desolate heap. Grief, vast, annihilating, surged over her. A black tide dragging her down into suffocating depths. The leader watched her collapse with detached, almost clinical interest, his expression momentarily blank, calculating before twisting back into that predatory smirk. He nudged Thomas's lifeless shoulder dismissively with the toe of his scuffed boot. "Waste of good rope," he muttered contemptuously. Then, turning his full undivided attention to the sobbing, broken figure huddled by the hearth, his voice dropped to a soft, almost coaxing tone, infinitely more terrifying than his earlier brutality. "Now," he murmured, taking a purposeful, unhurried step towards her crumpled form on the floor. "Where were we, little mother?" The remaining 3 conscious men shifted their weight and their cruel anticipation, a palpable poisonous miasma filling the small cabin. Their gazes fixed on her like hungry dogs surrounding fallen prey, utterly vulnerable, completely alone. A floorboard creaked loudly near the back wall, or was it outside more of them? She tensed, bracing subconsciously for another unimaginable blow. And then, the utterly impossible, the unbelievable. Silent as snowfall, faster than a striking prairie rattler, an arrow materialized, seeming to conjure itself from the shadowed depths near the violated doorway. It hissed through the thick, blood-tinged air, thwip, embedding itself with shocking force deep in the leader's exposed throat just above his collarbone. His eyes bulged wide in stunned, grotesque disbelief. Hands clawing uselessly, frantically at the feathered shaft protruding obscenely from his flesh. A wet, gurgling choke, thick and heavy with blood, was his only epitaph before he pitched forward, heavily crashing face down onto the slicking floorboards beside Thomas's pooling bloodstone, dead before he hit the ground. For a stunned, suspended heartbeat, the remaining 4 deserters, including the groaning man with the broken nose, clutching his face, froze absolutely still, jaws slack, their cruel bravado instantly vaporizing into raw, naked, uncomprehending fear. Where did that come from? They scrambled backward instinctively, fumbling clumsily for pistols holstered at their sides, eyes darting wildly terrified towards the accusing darkness of the open doorway. The shadowed corners, the silent windows, panic bloomed, sudden and chaotic among them. Another arrow zipped through the space, impossibly fast, unerringly accurate, striking Thomas's murderer Mick square in the chest. He staggered back hard against the rough log wall, clutching instinctively at the feathered shaft, buried deep, a look of utter shock and sudden, incomprehensible agony flooding his brutish face before sliding down the wall to join his leader in death's abrupt, silent embrace. Pure animal terror erupted, the remaining three scattered like startled quail flushed from cover. Two bolted simultaneously, desperately, for the apparent safety of the open doorway. A panicked scramble for sunlight and escape, turning their backs suicidally on the unseen, lethal threat hidden within the cabin's shadows. The third, and the one nursing his broken, bleeding nose, eyes wide with crazed panic, inexplicably lurched back towards Thomas's body. Perhaps seeking non-existent cover behind the table, perhaps simply driven mad by abject fear. A fatal error in judgment. A figure blurred in the doorway, moving with a speed and profound, unnerving silence that seemed to defy nature itself. Buckskin leggings molded to powerful thighs, dark twin braids interwoven with otter fur flying back from the speed of his movement. His face, lean, angular, sharply planed, was a mask of cold, diamond-hard purpose. A Comanche warrior, sinewy, economical in every motion, eyes burning with the intensity of focused righteous vengeance. In his hand, not a bow this time, but a heavy stone-headed war club, ancient in design, brutally effective in execution. He flowed into the room like smoke given tangible, deadly form. He sidestepped the panicked, clumsy lunge of the deserter near Thomas's body. With fluid grace, the war club whistled almost silently in a short, devastating arc. The sickening, wet crunch of skull imploding echoed obscenely loud in the sudden stillness. The man collapsed instantly, bonelessly a discarded puppet, whose strings had been violently severed meanwhile. The two fleeing towards the door had managed to draw clumsy pistols, spinning frantically, firing wildly back into the dim interior. Without aiming, bullets whined angrily. The Comanche moved with preternatural agility. A lethal dancer, weaving through the chaos, ducking instinctively. As lead slugs smacked harmlessly into the thick log walls behind him, sending splinters flying, whining, angry ricochets through the confined space. One deserter closest to the threshold spun again, trying to bring his weapon to bear. Firing wildly, a bullet splintered the doorframe inches from the warrior's head. He didn't even flinch. He closed the distance between them in two blindingly swift strides. Before either man could possibly hope to fire again accurately, the war club rose and fell twice. Two more sickening, wet impacts, brutally final. Two more bodies crumpled lifelessly, joining their comrades in a grotesque, tangled heap near the threshold. And sealing the exit, one of the dying men might have even managed a strangled, disbelieving whisper. Ambush, before silence reclaimed him utterly. Silence slammed back down heavier, now thicker, almost viscous, with the coppery tang of shed blood, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip from the table, and Rachel's shuddering, involuntary gasps for breath at the sanctuary of her home. Moments before filled with warmth and the scent of baking bread, was now a charnel house desecrated and awash in death. The Comanche warrior stood motionless amidst the carnage he had wrought his chest, rising and falling only slightly, betraying little exertion. He scanned the gruesome scene methodically, his dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing, taking in the tableau of sudden, violent death with an unnerving, profound calm. He spared only a brief, unreadable glance for Rachel still huddled, weeping silently by the hearth. Acknowledgement, perhaps, but not pity. Then his attention settled intensely, purposefully, on the slumped, bound figure of Thomas hanging over the table. Slowly, deliberately, he walked towards Thomas. He reached out a lean, steady hand, not with violence or desecration, but with an unexpected, solemn reverence. and gently closed Thomas's sightless eyes, granting him peace in death. He stood silently beside him for a long moment. Head slightly bowed, a warrior's posture of respect, then he spoke, low, resonant words uttered in the flowing, guttural cadence of the Numunu language. Spoken not for Rachel, but seemingly directed towards Thomas's departed spirit. Perhaps a prayer for his journey, perhaps an explanation for the vengeance enacted, a formal, respectful farewell offered from one man of honor to another who had died defending his own hearth and family. Rachel understood nothing of the words themselves, yet the profound solemnity, the aching respect woven intrinsically into the ancient sounds transcended the barrier of language. Who was this man? This sudden lethal savior appearing from nowhere? And why he clearly hadn't been tracking her. He'd been tracking them, the deserters. He moved like vengeance, incarnate, appearing like a phantom, and seemingly prepared to vanish, just as silently, his task completed. He knelt with fluid grace, retrieving his arrows with economical efficiency from the bodies, wiping them clean on a rag, produced from somewhere within his buckskins, pointedly ignoring the fallen men's weapons, meager possessions, and money pouches entirely. His eyes flickered momentarily towards the cooling loaves of bread on the sideboard. Precious sustenance in this harsh land. But he looked away again, taking nothing material for himself. His purpose here, grim, bloody, and swift, was fulfilled. He turned back then towards Rachel. She flinched involuntarily, raw terror still an open bleeding wound within her. He made no move closer. Maintaining a respectful distance, his gaze was intense, searching, holding hers across the blood-stained floor. He saw the shattered grief etched on her face, the residual terror lingering in her wide eyes, and the undeniable, fiercely protected life she instinctively shielded with her own body. His eyes lingered for a brief, significant moment on the worn leather pouch at her throat and the one Thomas had touched only hours before. The one holding the dried prairie rose and the strange dark hawk feather from the Red River borderlands recognition flickered subtly in his dark eyes, unmistakable. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately tapped his own chest twice, firmly, directly over his heart. A gesture profound in its simplicity, laden with unspoken meaning. Then his gaze shifted meaningfully, purposefully to the taut swell of her belly, before returning sharply to her eyes, a pledge, an acknowledgement, recognition rooted in a half-forgotten past, a connection she couldn't possibly fathom in that moment of shock and grief. He uttered a single soft, guttural word, resonant, final like stone, striking stone, carrying the weight of completion. Huma, avenged, balanced, paid, before turning sharply on his heel. With that single significant gesture, hanging potent and heavy in the charged, death-filled air, he stepped fluidly back out of the ravaged cabin, melting back into the indifferent embrace of the sun-scorched landscape, as silently and mysteriously as he had appeared. The wind gusted suddenly through the violated doorway, swirling dust and stray leaves across the bloodied floor, erasing any sign of his passage, leaving only the chilling echo of savage deliverance, the overwhelming cloying smell of death, and Rachel utterly alone once more. Adrift in an ocean of slaughter and incomprehensible grief, clutching desperately at the fragile, insistent spark of life flickering within her belly. The profound silence, broken only by the mournful howl of the plains, wine whipping around the cabin corners, and the frantic, terrified drumming of her own shattered heart against her ribs. The hours that followed dissolved into a suffocating gray fog of shock and disbelief. The sun bled across the western horizon in brutal, angry strokes of crimson and bruised violet, a cruel, indifferent mockery of the violence staining her cabin floor. Night fell like a heavy, suffocating shroud, bringing with it the spectral calls of unseen predators. Coyotes yipping in the distance, the eerie screech of an owl. Sounds that now seemed predatory and personal. Rachel remained numbly by the cold fireplace, incapable of coherent thought or purposeful movement. The bodies lay like grotesque, misplaced statues in the deepening gloom. The thick, metallic tang of blood hung heavy and sickening in the air. And Thomas remained slumped over the table, growing colder, irrevocably still, gone, forever gone. Their shared future, their dreams, their whispered promises, obliterated in a sickening instant of brutal violence. Deep in the starless, suffocating blackness of the night, a different kind of pain began its inexorable assault, not the phantom ache of grief consuming her heart, but something intensely physical, brutally visceral. A low grinding ache originating deep in her back, tightening like an iron vice around her heavily burdened belly. The baby cold, stark fear lanced through the insulating numbness of shock. No, oh God, please not now, not like this. But the contractions gripped her again, fierce, insistent, utterly ruthless, ripping her brutally back into the horrifying reality of her situation. Alone, surrounded by death and desecration, her child was coming into this. A raw, primal survival instinct, ancient, deeply maternal, fiercely protective, pierced the paralyzing veil of grief and terror. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not with them. Summoning strength dredged from some unknown, desperate reserve deep within her soul, fueled by a sudden surge of adrenaline and ferocious protective love. For the life stirring powerfully within her, Rachel forced herself to move. Each motion was agony, physical and emotional. Eyes deliberately averted from the sprawled, shadowed forms of the dead intruders, focusing only grimly on the necessary task at hand. First, Thomas' tears streamed freely, hot and stinging, blurring her vision, as clumsy, shaking fingers fumbled desperately with the stiff, blood-darkened ropes binding his wrists. Finally, agonizingly, the knot yielded. Gently, reverently whispering broken words of love and anguished farewell that were swallowed by the oppressive silence, she eased his cooling body down from the table, arranging his limbs with trembling hands, smoothing his sweat-dampened hair back from his forehead, a last trembling kiss on his cold brow. I love you, Thomas. Always, I swear. I'll protect our child, our hope. I promise you, my love, I promise. Then came the horrific necessity, dragging the dead weight of his murderers out of her home, reclaiming her violated sanctuary one by agonizing one. A Herculean, soul-scarring labor for a woman heavily pregnant and reeling from trauma, each sickening heave, each grotesque scrape of booted heel or limp limb across the floorboards, punctuated by her own choked grunts and gasps as relentless contractions tore through her ravaged body. Out into the consuming darkness, abandoned without ceremony to the indifferent earth and its unseen nocturnal scavengers, brutal, nauseating work, pushing her far beyond every conceivable physical and emotional limit, yet profoundly, elementally essential, a desperate primal need to reclaim her space, to cleanse it, however superficially, to make it safe for the impending arrival. Gray, exhausted dawn smudged the eastern horizon, painting the vast sky in shades of ash and despair, when the cabin was finally horrifically clear. Though dark, indelible stains remained on the wooden floor, mirroring the indelible scars etched onto her soul. Utterly depleted, bleeding, slightly slick with sweat and grime. Rachel collapsed onto her simple straw-tick bed as the contractions became relentless, overwhelming, demanding her full attention. Alone, terrifyingly alone, facing the primal crucible of birth in the desolate heart of unimaginable trauma. A cry tore from her throat, a sound mingling profound physical pain, unbearable loneliness, and stark, naked terror. Where was the Comanche? Had he truly just vanished? His violent purpose served leaving her to perish alone in this blood-soaked cabin. Was his act one of vengeance, only devoid of compassion? Just as despair threatened to finally crack her sanity wide open, a faint, unexpected sound intruded upon her agony. A soft scraping hesitant just outside the still damaged inner door. Terror surged anew, cold and sharp. Had one of the deserters somehow survived? Were more coming back, but the sound felt different, quieter, less aggressive. Holding her breath between the vice-like grip of the panes, she listened intently, straining her ears against the rushing sound in her head. A small bundle neatly wrapped in expertly cured hide, subtly marked with a geometric pattern she dimly recalled seeing on artifacts from the southern plains, tribes slid gently, almost silently, across the threshold, pushed carefully from outside by an unseen hand that had only the mournful sigh of the plains wane. Dragging herself painfully towards it during a brief lull, Rachel fumbled with the intricate rawhide ties with trembling fingers. Inside a small collection of dried herbs she recognized. Willow bark for pain-crushed raspberry leaf to aid labor. A small, cool water skin miraculously filled with fresh, clean water. And a piece of perfectly cooked, expertly dried venison, simple, essential life-giving. An offering of profound, staggering, anonymous significance. He hadn't abandoned her. He was still out there, watching, helping silently, protecting. An unseen, unguessed presence circling her fragile existence. That small act of anonymous, intensely practical kindness was a lifeline thrown into her abyss of despair, bolstered immeasurably by this silent assurance. Rachel faced the escalating, all-consuming ordeal of childbirth with fragile, renewed determination. As the morning sun climbed higher, flooding the blood-marked cabin with impartial, uncaring light, she fought her solitary, terrifying battle. Her cries of pain and exertion echoing against the log walls that had borne silent witness to passionate love and savage sudden death in less than 24 hours. And then finally, miraculously shattering the terrible blood-soaked silence. The first thin, tentative, yet utterly vital wail of new life. A daughter, small, perfectly formed, fiercely, defiantly alive. Rachel gathered the slippery, precious infant to her bruised, exhausted chest, weeping uncontrollably. Tears of fathomless sorrow for her lost Thomas mingled inextricably with overwhelming relief and fierce joy for this tiny miracle, wrested from the jaws of death and despair. Looking down into the baby's brand-new dark eyes that seemed to hold the ancient wisdom of the plains already, she whispered the name they had chosen together, a fragile prayer breathed into the stained, heavy air. Hope days bled into weeks, weeks dragged slowly into months under the vast, impassive gaze of the prairie sky. Rachel healed slowly physically, her body knitting itself back together with the stubborn resilience of the prairie grass outside her door. The wounds to her soul remained open raw, prone to bleeding unexpectedly in the lonely quiet of the long nights. But hope was a constant, warm, demanding anchor in the turbulent sea of her grief. A reason to rise each morning to face the endless horizon. She buried Thomas herself beneath the lone, sturdy cottonwood tree down by the creek where they had sometimes sat together, dreaming of the future marking the grave with heavy river stones gathered one by one, a humble, enduring monument to a love savagely severed but eternally remembered in her heart. She scrubbed the cabin obsessively, relentlessly, bleaching the horrific stains on the floorboards until they faded to ghostly reminders, purging the physical traces of the violation, though memories stalked her waking hours like phantom predators and invaded her weeping dreams with brutal clarity. The silence of the cabin held Thomas's crushing absence like a tangible weight, yet it was increasingly punctuated by Hope's gurgles, soft cries, and eventually by tentative, soul-healing, life-affirming laughter that felt like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. Self-reliance became her dented, scarred armor. Grief became her silent, burning fuel. She tended the small garden, fiercely willing life. From the reluctant soil patched the fence Thomas had been mending, each hammer blow a small act of defiance against despair. She learned the heft, the report, and the powerful kick of Thomas's Springfield rifle. Its cold, heavy weight becoming a grim, constant reassurance against the vast vulnerability of her isolation. Every sudden noise, a hawk's cry, a snapping twig, the wind whistling strangely in the chimney, made her jump hand flying instinctively to the weapon that was always kept near, always loaded. The horizon became a canvas, perpetually scanned for threats, for any sign of movement. But she stayed, she endured. This cabin, violated, stained with blood and sorrow, was also the repository of her last moments, with Thomas the sacred birthplace of her child. It had been bought at an unimaginable, horrific cost, leaving it felt like a deeper, more profound betrayal of his memory of their life together. She never saw the Comanche warrior again, not truly face to face, not clearly. Yet his protective presence remained an invisible, palpable perimeter around her solitary existence. After the first heavy snowfall blanketed the plains, that winter she awoke to find a narrow path inexplicably trod from her door to the woodpile, before dawn saving her precious strength. Once, while tracking scarce winter game, herself weak with hunger, she found a large, desperate timber wolf lying dead near the cabin's edge, killed cleanly by a single, expertly placed arrow through the eye. A lethal threat neutralized before she had even fully recognized its potential danger lurking just beyond the firelight. Sometimes, in the shifting, ambiguous light of twilight, standing by the creek near Thomas's grave, she thought she'd catch a flicker of movement at the distant tree line bordering the property. A shadow detaching itself momentarily from the deeper gloom, blending back seamlessly into the landscape before her eyes could truly focus. Her unseen guardian repaying a debt she hadn't fully understood until later. The full, staggering story of that debt surfaced, slowly pieced together from fractured memories weeks after the attack, rocking a sleeping hope by the flickering firelight. One lonely evening, Thomas hadn't spoken often or easily of his solitary journeys into dangerous territories. But this one particular tale, shared hesitantly, reluctantly, months after they were wed, the memory clearly still raw and troubling for him, now resonated with horrific, chilling clarity. 3 years prior, while scouting deep in the blood-soaked, lawless expanse of the Red River borderlands, known territory for raiding parties and desperate men, Thomas had stumbled upon an act of casual, sickening barbarity. A ragged army patrol, clearly far from their post, undisciplined, likely drunk or deserting themselves, had cornered a lone Comanche girl, barely more than a child, who had evidently become separated from her band. They were accusing her shrilly of spying, surrounding her menacingly on their horses, their leering intentions towards the terrified girl sickeningly clear, even from Thomas's concealed vantage point. They were preparing with casual cruelty to execute her on the spot, to make an example. One of them had bragged loudly. Thomas, hidden in a thicket nearby, watched in utter horror. He was a man of peace, fundamentally, who had chosen farming over fighting. But this cold-blooded murder disguised as frontier justice, his very soul recoiled from the blatant evil of it. Seizing a moment when the soldiers were arguing drunkenly amongst themselves about who would carry out the deed, he burst suddenly from cover, yelling fabricated warnings, shouting about spotting a larger Comanche war party approaching rapidly just over the ridge. In the ensuing momentary confusion and panic among the soldiers, he lunged forward, grabbed the terrified, trembling girl, noting vaguely a bleeding graze on her upper arm, and pulled her swiftly bodily into the dense scrub flanking the trail. A brief, disorganized chase followed with wild, unaimed shots fired blindly into the brush. But Thomas knew the terrain well from his prospecting days. He twisted, turned, doubled back, through dry creek beds and dense thickets, pulling the girl along until the angry, drunken shouts and crashing sounds faded into the distance behind them. The girl, whose name he later learned was Tiana, trembled violently, weak from fear shock and blood loss from the graze. He spoke almost no Comanche, she barely a single word of comprehensible English. Yet pain and fear were universal languages. Using remembered fragments of frontier knowledge, he carefully cleaned and dressed her bleeding arm with strips torn from his own precious neckerchief. He shared his meager canteen of water and the last of his dry rations with her. Across the vast, silent chasm of language and culture, communicated through gestures and expressions, a fragile, tentative trust began to form between the hunted white man and the rescued Comanche girl. For 3 grueling, intensely dangerous days and nights, they journeyed mostly under the cover of darkness, navigating by the familiar patterns of the stars. They moved cautiously, skirting known patrol routes, heading steadily towards the lands her nomadic band frequented. Dangers shadowed their every step. Capture by soldiers would mean a swift trial and a hangman's noose for Thomas for aiding an enemy. Discovery by Comanche warriors who didn't know the situation might mean a swift death for him before Tiana could possibly intervene or explain. Still guided by a simple, unwavering sense of right and wrong that was core to his being, Thomas pressed onward, protecting the girl as best he could. On the 3rd evening, near a hidden sheltered spring known only to hunters, they finally saw it. The faint, distant glow of campfires against the darkening sky. Tiana gasped aloud in profound relief, her dark eyes shining with sudden, overwhelming hope. She touched Thomas's arm lightly, her gratitude conveyed more eloquently in that simple gesture than any words could have expressed. Then shadows detached silently, suddenly from the surrounding twilight, Comanche warriors appearing like ghosts from the very earth. Among them, moving slightly ahead, was a young man, perhaps Tiana's older brother, his face a taut mask of grim worry that melted instantly into stunned, disbelieving relief upon seeing her alive. A gray elk? His sharp, assessing eyes fixed immediately, intensely hard on Thomas, narrowing instantly with deep suspicion, palpable hostility radiating from him. Like heat, his hand went instinctively, protectively, to the handle of the long knife sheathed at his belt. Tiana burst into an urgent torrent of flowing Comanche, gesturing rapidly towards Thomas, then towards her bandaged arm, recounting vividly the terrifying capture, the unexpected escape, the perilous journey, the strange white man's inexplicable kindness and protection. Gray Elk listened intently, his stern expression shifting slowly through stages of disbelief, sharp comprehension, and finally settling into a deep, grudging, undeniable respect. He looked back at Thomas, truly seeing him this time. Not just as another faceless white enemy Tabayor, but as the specific individual man who had inexplicably risked everything, risked his own life for his sister. "You save, Gray Elk," managed finally, his sparse English heavy with implication, rough but understandable. It was a statement of acknowledged fact, a life debt incurred sacred and binding. Thomas, weary beyond measure, wary but relieved, simply nodded slowly, meeting the intense gaze of the young warrior steadily across the small space between them. An unspoken, profound understanding passed between the two men, different in worlds, but recognizing a shared core of honor. No formal oaths were sworn, no bargains were struck, but a debt, deep, immutable, sacred within the warrior's code of honor, was silently, solemnly acknowledged between them. Gray Elk raised his hand slowly, palm outward, a gesture of grudging truce, perhaps even nascent respect, before turning without another word and melting back towards the welcoming glow of the distant campfires, with his rescued, weeping sister beside him. Thomas watched them go, relief washing over him in a wave, then slipped back silently into the vast wilderness alone, breathing a deep sigh, never speaking of the dangerous encounter again, except for that one hesitant recounting to Rachel. An act of simple human compassion undertaken with no thought of future reward or reciprocation. He never knew the warrior's name was Gray. Elk never dreamed for an instant that that single instinctive act of kindness would echo years later, swift, silent, and deadly as an arrow, saving the lives of his wife and his unborn child from a similarly brutal fate. Years unfolded like the slow turning of the seasons across the vast, unchanging plains. Rachel's small cabin, consecrated by profound love, horrific blood, and miraculous birth, transformed slowly, subtly once again. Whispers traveled like seeds on the prairie wind. Rumors about the solitary widow out on Sage Creek, tough as cured leather, fiercely independent, raising her young daughter alone after an unnamed tragedy had struck. The quiet woman whose door it was sometimes murmured in hushed, grateful tones amongst the scattered settlements was sometimes quietly, cautiously open to other women fleeing desperation, violence, or abandonment. Scarred, but fundamentally unbeaten, Rachel found an unexpected, quiet purpose, slowly blooming in the desolate ashes of her immense grief. Her isolated, hard-won home became a different kind of sanctuary, an unmarked, unofficial haven on the harsh, unforgiving frontier. First came a young wife, her face cruelly bruised, eyes filled with terror, escaping a brutish, drunken husband who treated her worse than livestock. Rachel took her in without question, sharing her meager space and food until the woman could safely move on. Later it was a gaunt, starving mother with two skeletal, silent children clinging to her skirts, left destitute after a suspected Indian raid, claimed her husband, and burned their homestead further west. Later still, as word quietly spread through unseen networks of shared female hardship, even a few desperate displaced Native women, wary and suspicious at first, found temporary cautious refuge and shared resources beneath Rachel's scarred but sturdy roof. Rachel offered what little she had: shelter from the elements, food harvested from her thriving garden, and secured through her learned trapping skills a compassionate, non-judgmental ear to listen to stories of hardship and the quiet, resonant strength born of shared survival against overwhelming odds. Hope grew up strong, capable, and observant amidst this shifting, transient circle of wounded women, slowly, tentatively rebuilding shattered lives, absorbing resilience and compassion. Like the thirsty earth absorbs precious rain. One quiet afternoon, Hope, already showing glimpses of her mother's fierce determination and her father's innate kindness, sat patiently helping Rachel mend a tear in a thin blanket for a newly arrived weeping woman, her small hands surprisingly deft for her age, her young eyes serious and filled with a solemn shared purpose. Learned early, Rachel never remarried. Thomas's memory remained her steadfast constellation and the fixed point by which she navigated her altered life. Her existence found its renewed meaning in raising Hope, who grew tall, strong, and fiercely capable, possessing her mother's deep resilience and unmistakable echoes of her absent father's quiet kindness, and in maintaining the fragile secret sisterhood occasionally sheltered beneath her scarred but welcoming roof. The sanctuary remained unmarked, its location shared only in desperate whispers between women in need. She endured, she persisted, she prevailed through meticulous gardening, careful trapping, shrewd barter at the distant trading post, and the occasional gratefully received cache of essential supplies left silently, inexplicably near her door under the cover of darkness. Sacks of flour, precious salt, sturdy woven blankets, sent discreetly perhaps by women who had moved on to rebuild their lives elsewhere, but never forgot the kindness and safety they had found on Sage Creek. And Gray Elk, the plain's elusive phantom protector, an unseen silent echo in her solitary life. Rachel never saw him clearly, definitively again. But the signs of his watchful presence persisted, infrequent, subtle, yet utterly unmistakable to her now attuned senses. A brace of plump rabbits left hanging neatly near the woodpile during a particularly lean, harsh winter when game was scarce and her traps were empty. A dangerous fissure in the steep creek bank, threatening erosion near Thomas's grave, after a flash flood found inexplicably shored up overnight with heavy, carefully placed stones she could never have moved alone. And every single winter, usually after the fiercest blizzards had passed, leaving the world pristine and white, she would find them fresh tracks in the virgin snow. Not the familiar prints of wolf or coyote, but the distinct, unmistakable pattern of a single man's soft-soled moccasins circling the cabin's perimeter, thoughtfully checking the vulnerable points, the windows, the repaired door, before vanishing back silently into the skeletal embrace of the cottonwood trees lining the creek. A silent sentinel. One year, when Hope was perhaps 6 winters old, a bright, inquisitive child, exploring with growing confidence near Thomas's grave, under the bare branches of the cottonwood. She found it nestled carefully amongst the smooth gray river stones marking the site. Not feathers this time, not supplies, something different. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, worn smooth as silk from much handling its lines, capturing perfectly the fierce grace of the very hawk species Rachel had seen circling and then fall silent on that terrible transformative day. So long ago, Hope brought the carving carefully back to the cabin, clutching it tightly in her small hand, her eyes wide with the wonder of discovery. "Look, Mama, a bird for Papa's sleeping place." Rachel took the small wooden carving, its smooth wood warm against her chilled palm. Instantly recognizing the artistry, the specific skill, the potent symbolism. Vigilance, memory, enduring connection. It felt deeper now than just watchful presence, more profound than mere repayment of a debt long settled. It felt like a silent, ongoing reassurance, a continued acknowledgement of the strange, powerful bond forged in sudden violence and unexpected compassion, a sacred promise kept faithfully, silently, across the desolate seasons, not a ghost, not just a lingering memory, Gray Elk, forever bound to her family's fate by an act of simple kindness reciprocated with unwavering, lifelong loyalty. His silent, unseen vigil a quiet testament to a fierce code of honor woven deeply into the harsh fabric of the frontier, a quiet pulse of shared humanity beating invisibly persistently in the wild, untamed heart of the vast, indifferent land. Rachel held the small wooden bird close, her heart aching with a poignant mixture of bittersweet memory and profound, humbling gratitude. She looked out through the cabin window towards the vast, windswept horizon, towards the silent, waiting plains where he watched unseen. And she whispered softly, not just to the sighing wind this time, but to him. "Thank you, Gray Elk, thank you." She spoke the words aloud, knowing with an unshakable certainty born of years of silent evidence, that here in her profound, enduring solitude, surrounded by the loving ghosts of what was lost, and the vibrant promise of what remained, she was never truly, completely alone. The debt repaid swiftly and terribly in blood was long settled according to his code, yet the silent watch endured an unbroken promise, carried eternally onward, whispered faithfully on the ceaseless winter wind.